This video is on Nehemiah, God's determined builder, from Nehemiah chapters 1 through 3. And my name is Dr. Joe Sprinkle. Determination is a wonderful human virtue. You often see determination seen in sports. Many years ago at the 1992 Olympics, there were two tremendously poignant moments. You have American sprinter Gail Devers, the clear leader in the 100-meter hurdles, who tripped over the last barrier. She agonizingly pulled herself to her knees and crawled the last 5 meters, finishing the race. She finished 5th, but she finished. And then there was the 400-meter semifinalist, Derek Redmond, a Brit, who tore his hamstring and fell to the track. He struggled to his feet and began to hobble, determined to complete the race. His father ran from the stands to help him off the track, but the athlete refused to quit. He leaned on his father, and the two of them limped to the finish line together to deafening applause. Both of these athletes showed great determination. Well, how determined are we as a church? In another video, I looked at a leader, Ezra. In this video, I move on to Ezra's younger contemporary, Nehemiah, who came back from exile some 13 years after Ezra. He would have arrived around the year 445 BC. Now, there were, by the way, different times that people returned from exile. The first return is described in Ezra chapters 1 through 6, where around the year 538 BC, you have Sheshbazzar, Zerubbabel, and Yeshua all involved in a return from exile that was permitted by the Persian king Cyrus, in which some 49,000, almost 50,000 people are listed as coming back. And then Ezra brought back another couple of thousand, actually had women and children, more like about 5,000 under Artaxerxes, which we believe to be Artaxerxes I, around 458 BC. And then also under the same Artaxerxes, you have Nehemiah allowed to go back and to rebuild the wall around Jerusalem. And so there were 3 returns from exile, and Nehemiah represents this third return from exile that's specifically recorded in the Bible. Well, are we a determined church? Charles Spurgeon sets things up for us. We're not called to govern as Nehemiah did with an iron hand, but we ought to be equally inflexible, decided, and resolute for God and for his holy will. And the thesis is that we can be a better church, a more successful church, a more determined church if we learn from the example of Nehemiah. Well, who was Nehemiah? Well, it says that I was the cupbearer of the king. That's chapter 1 and verse 11. Now, a cupbearer was not a menial office, but one of great importance, involving tasting the king's wine for poison and guarding the royal apartment. Such a trusted person often became a confidant and informal counselor of a king. You might compare Mordecai's position under Xerxes in the book of Esther. And he could influence the king's decisions to a considerable degree. Anyway, Nehemiah, whose name means the Lord comforts, reflects his name by the fact that the Lord comforted his people through the work of Nehemiah as the cupbearer of the king, who was given permission to go back and to rebuild the wall. And Nehemiah is one of those heroes of Scripture because he was willing and determined to risk his job, to risk his reputation, and even his life for the work of God. Again, Artaxerxes was active from around 464 to 424 BC, who is the same king that Ezra worked with as well. Well, what did Nehemiah do to further God's work? Well, one, Nehemiah recognized and took a determined, passionate interest in the problems of God's people. And we'll read about that in Nehemiah chapter 1, verses 1 through 4. Now, it begins with an account of some bad news that the gates of the city had been burned and the walls of Jerusalem had been torn down. And he hears about that from a fellow Jew, as we read about here. It says, the words of Nehemiah, the son of Hakaliah. Now it happened in the month of Chislev, in the 20th year, as I was in Susa, the citadel, that Hanani, one of my brothers, that means a fellow Jew, came with certain men from Judah. And I asked them concerning the Jews who escaped, who had survived the exile, and concerning Jerusalem. And they said to me, the remnant there in the province who had survived the exile is in great trouble and shame. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down and its gates are destroyed by fire. As soon as I heard these words, I sat down and wept and mourned for days. And I continued fasting and praying before the God of heaven. Nehemiah's reaction was extreme distress when he heard that things apparently very recently had gone bad for Jerusalem. I mean, Jerusalem was destroyed by the Babylonians in 586, and here we're more than a century after that. So I don't think it would be that event that he would be mourning about. It'd be something more recently, some sort of insurrection perhaps that was put down by the state. But when he heard about it, he was deeply concerned for God's people in extreme distress. And, why were these walls so important? Well, in a practical sense, a wall is used to defend a city against invasion or besiegement. But could not dependence on walls be counterproductive, leading to human material might rather than maybe depending on the spiritual God? I think the ultimate reason why Nehemiah was so upset by the walls of the city being broken down was that the walls of the city and the city itself was a symbol of true religion. This was not just any city, but it was the city of God, the dwelling place of God, where God's temple was. In the earlier video, we talked about how Ezra had come back to beautify that temple. Well, the crumbling of God's holy city, Jerusalem, represents a crumbling of right religion. Should not Jerusalem be built in a way appropriate to its distinction as the city of God? The real danger for the Jews at this stage of their history was one of assimilation into the pagan world rather than pride in their might. The rebuilding of Jerusalem and its walls would be a symbol that God had not forsaken his people and that God was still active among them. With such a symbol, people could identify and unite around. Now, one reason that Nehemiah was so successful in accomplishing the work of God is because he cared. He cared deeply and determinedly for God and his church. Unless members of a church care about its condition, it can never improve. Do you care if you see the foundations of God's church crumbling? Do you care enough to become emotionally involved in the church? Well, Nehemiah was. Do you care enough to weep when things go wrong with God's church? Care enough not only to point your finger at what's wrong with the church, but to pull up your sleeves and to be a part of the solution? The first step in becoming a better church is to observe the problems and to take a determined, compassionate interest in them. My next point is that Nehemiah waited determinedly on God in prayer. And you can read about that in Nehemiah 1, 4 through 11. Let me read the verses again. As soon as I heard these words, I sat out and wept and mourned for days, and I continued fasting and praying before the God of heavens. And I said, O Lord, God of heaven, the great and awesome God who keeps covenant and steadfast love with those who love him and keep his commandments, let your ear be attentive and your eyes open to hear the prayer of your servant, that I now pray before you day and night for the people of Israel, your servants, confessing the sins of the people of Israel, which we have sinned against you. Even I and my father's house have sinned. We have acted very corruptly against you and have not kept the commandments, the statutes, and the rules that you commanded your servant Moses. Remember the word that you commanded your servant Moses, saying, if you are unfaithful, I will scatter you among the peoples. But if you return to me and keep my commandments and do them, though your outcasts are in the uttermost parts of heaven, from there I will gather them and bring them to the place that I have chosen to make my name dwell there. They are your servants and your people, whom you have redeemed by your great power and your strong hand. O Lord, let your ear be attentive to the prayer of your servant, and let the prayer of your servants who delight to fear in your name, and give success to your servant today, and grant him mercy in the sight of this man. Now, when Nehemiah hears what had happened to Jerusalem, he doesn't act immediately or rashly, but he first of all brings the matter before God in prayer. And in many ways, Nehemiah's prayer is a model prayer. It acknowledges who God is. He's the Lord God of heaven, the great and awesome God, the God who loves his people. So he acknowledges who God is. He also confesses his and his people's sins. We have sinned against you. Even I and my father's house have sinned. He asks for God to act on the basis of his covenant. You're the God who keeps covenant and steadfast love with those who love him. And you made a promise that if you return to me and keep my commandments and do them, even though your outcasts have been scattered to the uttermost parts of heaven, from there I will gather them and bring them to the place I have chosen to make my name dwell there. And so it's a wonderful prayer, a model prayer in many ways. And great works of God often begin with prayer. We want to be a better church. We don't begin by rushing out and doing something. We begin with prayer. Or as Jesus put it, apart from me, you can do nothing. God's work can be accomplished in the world only through God's help. And if we do it on our own, it'll only be a work of the flesh and not a work of God. But God has given us the promise of his help if only we would take advantage of it. Again, his promise, but if you return to me and keep my commandments and do them, though you are outcasts in the uttermost parts of heaven, from there I will gather them and bring them to the place that I have chosen to make my name dwell there. If we look to God, he will keep his promises and bless us, as this verse states. And again, Nehemiah's plan, he prays, but he also has a plan. O Lord, let your ear be attentive to the prayer of your servant, to the prayer of your servants who delight in fear in your name, and give success to your servant today, and grant him mercy in the sight of this man. This man, he's talking about Artaxerxes. He's not only praying, but praying that he would have an opportunity to speak to King Artaxerxes, for whom he is a cupbearer, and to seek to bring about some good for Jerusalem that is in such dire distress. In other words, he prays concretely for the needs of God's people, and then he looks for ways to accomplish his prayer. And again, I think that's an example and model for us. We should pray, but not just pray, but also pray, and while we're praying, formulate plans and get ready to put those plans in effect if God answers our prayer and gives us opportunity. Nehemiah had the courage and faith and determination to act when the opportunity came. We'll read about that in Nehemiah 2, 1 through 8. In the month of Nisan, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, when the wine was before him, I took up the wine and gave it to the king. Now I had not been sad in his presence, and the king said to me, "Why is your face sad, seeing that you are not sick? This is nothing but sadness of heart." And then I was very much afraid. I said to the king, "Let the king live forever. Why should not my face be sad when the city, the place of my father's graves, lies in ruins and its gates have been destroyed by fire?" And then the king said to me, "What are you requesting?" And so I prayed to the God of heaven. Now, he'd been praying for a whole long time. This was kind of a quick, sometimes people call it arrow prayers. It was kind of like, "Lord, help me," a quick prayer, and then he made his request. And I said to the king, "If it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor in your sight, that you send me to Judah, to the city of my father's graves, that I may rebuild it." And the king said to me, the queen sitting beside him, "How long will you be gone? And when will you return?" And so it pleased the king to send me when I had given him a time. And I said to the king, "If it pleases the king, let letters be given to me, to the governors of the province beyond the river, that they may let me pass through until I come to Judah, and a letter to Asaph, the keeper of the king's forest, that he may give me timber to make beams for the gates of the fortress of the temple, and for the wall of the city, and for the house that I shall occupy." And the king granted me what I asked, for the good hand of God was upon me. Now, Nehemiah made this request, and it was a dangerous thing to do because it could be taken wrongly. It may have been at the king's orders that Jerusalem, the walls had been torn down, perhaps putting down some sort of insurrection there. But he made the request, appealing to the king's heart, appealing to the fact that his ancestors' graves were there. And he granted that request. And so he made the 600-mile trek from Susa all the way back to Jerusalem, all of which were a part of the Persian, Medo-Persian Empire. And when he arrived there, he began assessing the problems. He actually made a little tour at night where he surveyed the broken walls of Jerusalem and started formulating plans as to how he could remedy the problem. Now, one of the problems that I've observed in life is that the world is full of two types of people, it seems like. There are the thinkers and there are the doers. And the problem with the thinkers is that they don't tend to do anything. They think about the problem, but then they don't do anything about what they think. And then there's the doers, and the problem with the doers is that they don't much think. They just jump in and do something, whether it's the right thing to do or the wrong thing to do. Here you have a case of somebody who was both a doer and a thinker. Nehemiah was a thinker. He waited for 4 months, it says, and according to chapter 1 and verse 6, during which time he prayed and continued thinking about the problem of the devastation of Jerusalem. But then he was also a doer. When the opportunity appeared, he acted. He made the request to the king. And when he gets there, he is definitely a doer and putting together plans, a plan of action for what was to take place. Prayer should not be a substitute for an action, but a preparation for action. And in this case, acting did take a great deal of courage. In fact, when the king inquired as to why he was so sad, the first thing it says was, "I was very much afraid." Does courage mean not being afraid? I don't really think so. Courage means braving danger. It means acting despite fear, not being paralyzed by fear. Only a fool wouldn't have been at least nervous to approach the king on this matter. I mean, his action might have been misinterpreted as, you're wanting to support another insurrection in Jerusalem. And Nehemiah was no fool. But he did have the courage to act despite his fear, even though it might have gotten him in hot water. Courage, you might say, is the mother of almost every other virtue. It's easy to be honest, that there's no risk in honesty, but if you tell the truth when it might get you in trouble, well, then that's courage. And it takes courage to make God's church better. It may cause us to act, to risk our reputation, or to make us subject to displeasure when we work towards what really needs to be done. But for us to make the church better, we need to have the courage to act. Without courage, nothing great ever gets accomplished for God. Jesus had to face the cross. Paul had to face persecution, being arrested and flogged and in prison, and ultimately even beheaded. Early Christians were led to the lions in the Colosseum. We need not be rash in our actions, but we must be brave. And when we act, we should expect opposition. And that's exactly what Nehemiah ended up facing. Verse 19 of chapter 2. Having done a survey and having announced his plans of rebuilding the wall, but then Sanballat, the Horonite, and Tobiah, the Ammonite servant, and Geshem, the Arab, heard of it. They jeered at us and they despised us and said, "What is this thing that you're doing? Are you rebelling against the king?" And then I replied to them, "The God of heaven will make us prosper, and we, his servants, will arise and build, but you have no portion or right or claim in Jerusalem. Now, these are not just random opponents. Sanballat was the governor of Samaria, the kingdom just to the north of Judah. Tobiah was the governor of the Ammonites, which also bordered Judah. And the Geshem was the governor of the Arabs to the south. And they threatened him by accusing him of treasonous action. And they threaten him even more later on by threatening to invade if they don't quit building that wall. Those who seek to do great things for God can expect opposition, but we can also expect God to give us the means to overcome opposition. Nehemiah was well prepared for the opposition and used every legal course available to him to combat it. And he doesn't overreact, but simply states that God is with him and he's going to rebuild, in effect, leaving to God the responsibility of handling this negative opposition. And so what does Nehemiah do? Nehemiah was supported by God's people, united in determined purpose and action. And there again, this is an example for us. We should be a people united in determined purpose and action as the church functions. You see that in Nehemiah chapter 3. In Nehemiah chapter 3, you have an outline that I don't want to get bogged down in, but we see what they did on the north wall, how they organized the rebuilding of the north wall in verses 1-7 of chapter 3, and then how they organized the rebuilding of the west wall in chapter 3, 8-13, and then of the south wall in chapter 3 and verse 14, and then of the east wall in chapter 3, 15-32. And Nehemiah did not do this all by himself. It took united action by God's people to accomplish this work. Lots of people joined in on Nehemiah's dreams and plans. If they hadn't done it, he couldn't have built the wall by himself. He needed God's people to unite in behind his plan. And it gives us the lesson, there's power in united action by God's people. There was a unity of intention in which many different kinds of people with different interests and motives joined in with Nehemiah and were willing to put aside their personal preferences and to work in a united way and to follow his plan of action. Great things can happen when God's people can set aside their pride and unite in this way. And there's no telling, indeed, what God can do in a place when God's people are willing to work together. And so in some 52 days, Nehemiah rebuilt the walls of Jerusalem. It was a remarkable feat that only he could do. The church works with united action of God's people. Now, my current church is between pastors, which is why I'm doing a little bit of preaching for them right now. And future pastors, all pastors really, need the help of God's people. Pastors cannot produce a great work of God in any place by themselves any more than Nehemiah could have built the walls of Jerusalem by himself. Ultimately, if the church members, it's the church members who are essential in doing something great for God in the church. The preacher can guide and encourage and exhort, but God's people have to do the hard work. And everyone is needed. Different people have different tasks in the work of God. In the story of Ezra back in Ezra chapters 7 through 10, Ezra was more of a scholar. Nehemiah was more of a doer. Paul in 1 Corinthians 12 talks about the church as a body, and different parts of the body have different functions. So different members of the church will have different gifts and talents and work differently towards the overall purpose of the body. And when each member of the church is working together using his or her own gifts and functions, well, it contributes to the whole. And no one's contribution is unnecessary. There should be a determination to work with unity of purpose. Are you doing things that might undermine the work of the church and the unity of the spirit of the church? When decisions of a church have been made, not everybody's going to get their way. And Nehemiah's workers could have said, I think the wall should go here, or that it should be made out this way, out of this kind of material, or be constructed differently. The whole thing could have fallen apart with infighting, and no wall would have been built. But we must be willing to go along with decisions that church leaders make, even if we may have preferred doing it a somewhat different way. We should not be sources of dissension, but there needs to be determination with unity of purpose. And so we can learn from Nehemiah's example. Like Nehemiah, we should take a determined, passionate interest in the problems of God's people. Like Nehemiah, we should wait determinedly on God in prayer. We should have the courage, faith, and determination to act. And we should be united and determined in purpose and action for furthering the work of God's kingdom through the church. And if we do these things, God may well do a wonderful work among us, the way that he did among the people of Nehemiah's day. So that's my presentation on Nehemiah, God's determined builder. And my name is Dr. Joe Sprinkle.